My son stood in the vineyard, the land the government awarded me after everything my husband and I gave to this country, and told strangers I was no longer mentally fit to manage it. He said I needed to be protected, that I should step aside. I didn't argue. My husband had fallen on the battlefield. I had learned how to live as a disabled veteran with only one arm, but I never expected the deepest wound to come from my own blood. That day, I stayed silent, but something inside me shifted. It was a silence that no longer wanted peace. When disappointment turns into betrayal, what does a mother do next? I buried my husband, but I will not bury my dignity. My son called the meeting himself. He didn't ask me. He didn't suggest. He announced it, said it was urgent and necessary, using that tone he always saved for moments he thought made him look important. I didn't argue. I just told him to make sure everyone parked out front and not on the gravel path. The last thing I needed was tire ruts near the vines. It was a warm afternoon, the kind that makes the hills of Sonoma look like they're lit from within. I'd just finished checking the irrigation valves when I saw them pull up. Malcolm stepped out first, suit jacket too tight for his frame, tie too loose. He was trying to look polished, but the sweat at his temples told the truth. Behind him, his wife Celine followed in heels that sank into the dirt with every step. And then two men I didn't recognize. Clean shoes, empty eyes. They all walked up the path toward the house like they owned the place. I didn't offer drinks. I didn't offer seats. I stood near the old wine press under the oak tree. That press has outlived 2 generations. It still works, still holds stories. Malcolm cleared his throat. We're here today because some concerns have been raised about the future of the property. I didn't say anything. He kept talking. It's about long-term planning, about protecting your interests, ensuring the vineyard remains viable, legally sound, structurally managed. Celine folded her arms, nodding along like she was watching a PowerPoint presentation. That's when Malcolm pulled out the folder. Thick, tabbed, color-coded. These are the documents. Everything's been reviewed. The transfer will place the land under managed conservatorship, with oversight from myself and appointed trustees. It allows you to enjoy your life without worrying about operations. I still said nothing. He took a step closer. Mum, it's time. Let us take care of this. You've done enough. I looked past him, the vineyard stretched behind his shoulder, rows and rows of vines moving gently in the breeze. The land had been given to me after the war, not as a handout, as recognition. My husband died on foreign soil. I lost an arm in a blast that killed 5 others. They gave me 5 acres and a house to start over. And I had. I'd made peace with the missing part of me, filled the silence with pruning shears and harvests. And now, my son stood on that soil, telling me I was no longer fit to stand on it. I took the folder from his hand. I flipped through it. He started to explain again, but I raised a hand. He fell silent. I nodded slowly, as if I was thinking it through. Fine, I said. His shoulders dropped. Celine exhaled. One of the men smiled, just a little. But my voice didn't change when I added, I'll have Eleanor review it. Malcolm blinked. The accountant, I clarified. She's known me 30 years. She'll let me know what I'm signing. I handed the folder back and walked toward the house. Behind me, I heard Celine whisper something sharp. I didn't need to know the words. I'd heard the same tone from officers who didn't want women in command. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open. Eleanor came by after dinner. She brought lemon bars. We went page by page. What they had prepared wasn't just a transfer of management. It was a full financial severing. Once signed, I would have no legal access to the vineyard, no control, no say in how or when anything was sold. I'd still live there, yes, but as a guest. Eleanor looked at me. Do you want to fight this? I nodded once. Then I stood up, went to the filing cabinet near the pantry, and pulled out the other folder. The one with Thomas Greer's name on it. My old CO turned legal counsel. He'd warned me something like this might happen. I just never thought it would come from my own blood. I showed Eleanor the documents Thomas helped me prepare months ago. A trust, quietly established, legally protected, binding. She read them. Malcolm doesn't know, she said quietly. No. Then let him keep talking. I nodded again. That night, I sat outside near the back fence, watching the stars come up over the ridge. There's a kind of quiet that settles after betrayal. It doesn't scream. It doesn't cry. It just breathes differently. He thinks I'm still that girl who trusted too easy. He forgot I came home with more steel in me than I left with. I won't be signing what he brings next. He'll sign something instead. And he won't even see it coming. If you've ever felt like someone in your own family tried to erase you while smiling to your face, stay with me. This story doesn't end politely. It ends on my terms. 2 days after the meeting, Malcolm came back. This time, without Celine or the suits. He arrived just before dusk, the sun low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the vineyard. He didn't come to talk. He came with a clipboard. I watched from the porch as he paced along the edge of the vines, pretending to inspect something. He'd never walked this land when it needed pruning. Never once showed up when irrigation broke or the frost hit early. But now he was measuring rows, counting steps, acting like he knew something about rootstock or soil acidity. I didn't move. I let him finish whatever little performance he thought he was putting on. Eventually, he walked up to the porch. Didn't ask to sit. Just leaned on the railing like he owned the place. He said the investors needed an updated valuation. Something official, he claimed. I nodded like I believed him. He talked in circles for a while, about revenue, about projections, about monetizing underutilized land. Then he paused, looked out over the vines, and said he was meeting with a developer later in the week. Someone interested in acquiring adjacent parcels, including mine. I didn't react. Not in my face, not in my voice. He added that things were moving quickly, and I should really consider signing the revised agreement. Said it would be cleaner for everyone. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled, tapped his clipboard, and left. The moment he drove off, I called Thomas. We had prepared for this, but now it was here, and I didn't want to lose momentum. He confirmed what I already suspected. Malcolm was laying groundwork. If I stayed passive, he'd move to file a motion claiming I was unfit to manage property. He'd try to push it through court based on fabricated evaluations and manipulated documentation. That night, I met Eleanor at the community centre. We sat in the back parking lot, windows down, documents between us on the passenger seat. She had gone through Malcolm's last draft. He had slipped in clauses meant to trigger a transfer of power if I failed to respond to financial requests within a 10-day period. It wasn't just underhanded, it was predatory. We didn't need more proof of intent. But I wanted it. So we built the next step. Eleanor created a duplicate of the updated agreement Malcolm was pushing. It looked identical, but was completely unenforceable. We watermarked it, time-stamped it, and filed it under my name with our legal witness. The bait was set. The next afternoon, I called Malcolm, told him I wanted to meet. Just the two of us. We met near the north slope of the vineyard, where the oldest vines were. He liked that side, said it had more character. I had always thought that was his way of pretending he appreciated things he never worked for. I handed him the folder, told him I'd read through his proposal again and wanted to give it another try. He opened the folder, barely skimming it, and signed immediately. He was too confident, too eager. What he didn't know was that the signature on that copy triggered a breach under a separate clause in the trust, a clause that Eleanor and Thomas had built in specifically for this purpose. It was done. That evening, I had the signature verified and the violation filed. Legally, it changed everything. Now we had concrete evidence of malicious intent and fraudulent coercion. But I wasn't finished. I spent the next day with Sophie, walking the property, taking notes on everything she had done this season. Her work ethic was steady. She had trained new hires, restructured harvest schedules, and even solved a mildew problem that could have ruined the Cabernet section. I had already started the process of naming her as Transitional Operations Manager under the trust. She didn't know yet, but she would. The following morning, a letter was sent from Thomas's office to Malcolm and his attorney. It was brief, direct, and final. Effective immediately, Malcolm Lancaster was prohibited from acting on behalf of or making decisions regarding the Lancaster vineyard or any assets connected to it. I heard nothing for the rest of the day. No calls, no emails, just quiet. Until dusk. He showed up again, this time without a clipboard, no jacket, no mask of politeness. He stepped onto the porch, stood in the same spot as before. But he didn't lean this time. He stared at me like he didn't recognize who he was dealing with. I let him stand there. I didn't offer him a chair. He said he was confused, said the letter must be a mistake, asked if this was some kind of overreaction. I told him the signature was his, that I had offered transparency, and he had offered deceit. He raised his voice, accused me of manipulating him, said he was just trying to help. I didn't flinch. I had heard better lies from worse men. He left, not long after. Not a word of apology, not a single question about what would happen next. But I already knew. The wheels were turning now, and nothing he did could stop what was coming. The wine festival was held the third weekend of October, the same weekend every year. It drew tourists from Napa, investors from San Francisco, and more reporters than the county fair ever had. People came for the tastings, for the awards, for the chance to be seen walking the rows of vines with a glass in hand and a story to tell. This year, Malcolm had volunteered to co-host the main ceremony. It wasn't subtle. He wanted FaceTime with potential buyers. I heard through Eleanor that he had even arranged a short speech to open the event. Something about honoring tradition while planning for the future. I didn't plan to attend until I realized how perfect the timing was. Everything had fallen into place. The trust was legally secured, his breach was documented, and he had publicly inserted himself into the festival, which meant he wouldn't be able to run from what was coming. I spoke with Thomas early that morning. He confirmed the documents were filed. A press copy was prepared, a statement drafted, and the clip was edited. Yes, there was a clip. 1 week earlier, I had invited Malcolm to the house under the pretense of discussing transitional planning. He arrived casual, too relaxed, assuming I had softened. I had asked Sophie to set a voice recorder in the hallway. She knew where to hide it. The hallway between the porch and kitchen caught everything. In that recording, Malcolm bragged about securing a tentative deal with a developer, called the vineyard undervalued, and said I wouldn't understand the scale of the opportunity. He referred to me as senile but sweet, and admitted he planned to ease me out slowly, keep me on site just long enough for optics, then transition me out of the property entirely once he had full control. I didn't say much during the meeting, just let him talk. Sophie uploaded the file that night and sent it to Thomas. I never even touched it. Now, it was ready. And so was I. I arrived at the festival 30 minutes before the opening remarks. I didn't wear anything dramatic, just the same navy dress I wore to my husband's funeral, paired with the silver pin he gave me before deployment. It was the only thing I had left that was truly his. Sophie walked beside me. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough. She carried a small folder. I carried nothing but a quiet kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The festival stage was set up on the east lawn, rows of chairs filled with guests, sponsors, local press. Banners with vineyard logos fluttered against the breeze, tables of wine glasses already half emptied. Malcolm was center stage, talking to a man in a tailored blazer, laughing, smiling. He didn't see me right away. Then he did. His face shifted. Not fear, just confusion. I sat in the front row. Sophie stood near the press table. She gave me a small nod. The host took the mic, welcomed everyone, gave thanks to the local sponsors. Then he introduced Malcolm as a representative of one of Sonoma's legacy vineyard families. Malcolm took the stage, spoke smoothly, practiced, said the vineyard had entered a new phase, said he was proud to take on greater leadership, said his goal was to build on the past without being bound by it. Then he gestured toward me, called me a guiding hand. I didn't blink. When he finished, the applause was polite. Then the host announced a brief intermission before the awards segment. That was my cue. I stood up, walked up the side stairs. The mic was still hot. I thanked the host quietly, then turned to face the crowd. Some knew me, some didn't. But all of them saw me as Malcolm's mother. I told them I was here to clarify a few things, not to speak in anger, not to shame anyone, just to correct the record. Then I asked Thomas's assistant, who had arrived earlier, to hand the press table the printed release. He did. Reporters opened the envelope. Inside was a certified statement of legal transfer. The vineyard, effective 3 weeks ago, had been moved into a protective trust. Ownership, management, and all associated rights had been removed from private hands and placed under the stewardship of a non-profit dedicated to preserving veteran farmland. Then I paused, and I nodded to Sophie. She tapped her phone. The audio began to play. Malcolm's voice echoed through the lawn. Clear, arrogant. He talked about me like I wasn't there. Talked about the land like it was a chess piece. Talked about removing me like it was just paperwork. When the clip ended, the silence was heavier than before. I looked at Malcolm. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. Then I ended with one sentence. The land doesn't belong to him. It never did. I left the stage. People didn't clap. Not yet. But they didn't look at Malcolm anymore either. The host tried to recover, moved the event forward. But the mood had shifted. Malcolm left before the ceremony ended. He didn't look at me when he passed. But I saw his hands shaking. 3 days after the wine festival, the fallout began. The first call came from the local press. They wanted a statement from Malcolm, then from the county's agricultural board, then from the bank that had underwritten part of his business loans. Everyone had watched the clip. Everyone had read the trust filings. It was no longer just gossip. It was official. By the end of the week, 2 board members from his investment group resigned. One of them quietly forwarded a series of emails to Thomas, emails in which Malcolm had misrepresented himself as the sole decision-maker of the vineyard. It was all there in writing. Fraud, plain and simple. Thomas moved fast. The legal team filed a cease and desist against any further claims Malcolm attempted to make on the property. At the same time, Eleanor worked to close every remaining access Malcolm had to financial accounts tied to the vineyard. Even the utility bills were rerouted under the non-profit trust. The vineyard, as a functioning asset, was no longer his to touch. Then came the state inquiry. An anonymous tip had been submitted to the Business Practices Oversight Committee, likely from someone at the festival. The complaint outlined fraudulent activity, abuse of elder law provisions, and an attempt to leverage medical conservatorship for financial gain. They opened an investigation. Malcolm tried to call me twice that weekend. I didn't pick up. He sent a text the third day, just one sentence. "You didn't have to do this." I didn't reply. By Monday, his personal accounts were frozen. A lien had been placed on his condo, and the law firm that had once represented him quietly pulled back. They claimed conflict of interest and withdrew. None of this was my doing alone. It was the consequence of his own hand, of arrogance stitched too tightly with entitlement. I wasn't celebrating. There's no joy in watching your child unravel. But I wasn't apologizing either. That same week, Sophie was promoted officially. We signed the paperwork in Thomas's office. She looked surprised, even nervous, but I saw the way her eyes steadied when she read the job title. Operations Director. She earned it. I didn't give it to her out of sentiment. She had worked this land with consistency and care. She knew every worker's name, every irrigation valve, every picking schedule. The transition was quiet, professional, and complete. Then something happened I hadn't expected. A reporter from a regional magazine asked to profile the vineyard. Not because of the drama, but because they had caught wind of the Trust's mission. They wanted to write about agricultural lands being used to support aging veterans and widowed women. The new model, they called it. A return to dignity through stewardship. I agreed to the interview. Not because I wanted attention, but because I knew there were women like me who had been pushed aside, who had given decades to a family and ended up replaced by paperwork and silence. I told the truth about what I had lost, what I had protected, what I had reclaimed. The article ran 2 weeks later. They called it "The Vineyard That Refused to Be Stolen." I kept a single copy, tucked it into a drawer beneath old medals and faded letters. Malcolm was still silent, until he wasn't. Late one evening, Thomas forwarded me a new letter. Malcolm had filed a civil suit, claiming emotional distress, loss of reputation. He was seeking damages. It would not hold. Every document, every recording, every financial trail was clean on our end. Still, it was a move, a desperate one, and desperate men can be loud. Thomas responded formally. The case, if it even progressed, would be countered with evidence of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and an active investigation already underway. I didn't lose sleep. I had weathered bigger storms. But I did walk the vineyard that night. No flashlight, just starlight and the soft sound of crickets. I ran my hand along the rows, remembered the first year I lived there, the silence that followed my husband's death, the weight of his name engraved on a memorial wall somewhere in Arlington, and the way the air had smelled when I first walked this land. It wasn't mine because of a deed. It was mine because I had learned to breathe again here. And I wasn't going to let a man who had never felt the soil beneath his hands dictate what it meant to me. The next morning, I asked Sophie to set up a staff meeting. Just a small one, core team only. We met near the shed, under the canvas awning, no clipboards, no formal agenda. I told them what was coming, that Malcolm was making noise, and some of it might hit the local press, but that nothing would touch the work they were doing. The trust protected the land. The land protected us. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded. That same day, Eleanor finalized the shift in payroll structures. Staff would now be listed under the non-profit arm. It created more legal distance, more layers of protection. 2 days later, Malcolm's lawsuit was dismissed, not for lack of merit, but for being filed improperly, with inaccurate claims and insufficient evidence. The judge didn't even call a hearing, just issued a summary dismissal. Thomas sent me a short message. "It's done." I looked out the window of the kitchen. The vines were just starting to shift color, early signs of autumn curling into the edges of the leaves. Malcolm had been loud, calculating, cruel, but in the end, he hadn't seen the quiet power of being methodical, of being ready, of being underestimated. He wouldn't come back. I knew that now. What remained was mine to tend, and I intended to do just that. It was early evening when I saw his car again, the same silver sedan he used when he still called this place home. He parked near the back fence, not the driveway, as if that would somehow make his arrival feel less deliberate. I stayed on the porch. He didn't knock. He walked across the yard like someone avoiding footsteps. The sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the gravel. I didn't stand. I didn't greet him. I just watched him take the same steps he had taken as a boy, though this time they were slower. When he reached the steps, he paused. His eyes didn't meet mine right away. His hands were empty. He asked if we could talk. I said nothing. I moved my hand slightly, just enough to gesture to the empty chair across from me. He sat down. For a long time, neither of us said a word. The vineyard stretched quiet behind us, the last of the golden hour painting the rose in amber. The breeze was light, just enough to stir the air. He looked thinner than I remembered, his collarbone too sharp, eyes dull, like he hadn't slept well in days. His mouth opened once, closed again. Then finally he spoke. He said he never meant for it to go this far, that he was under pressure, that he thought he was doing the right thing. I listened. He said he had always felt like I didn't trust him, that he wanted to prove himself, that he never intended to take everything away. I still listened. He started to shift blame, said he was misled by people he thought were on his side, said the lawyers didn't explain things clearly, said the business world moved faster than he expected. I stayed silent. He dropped his gaze after a while. Then he said he was sorry. He said it like someone who wasn't sure the words would help, but knew they were all he had left. I waited a moment before answering. I told him that sorry was something a person earned the right to say, that it wasn't a shortcut, that it wasn't a closing line. He nodded, slowly. I asked him if he remembered the winter I broke my wrist, how I had wrapped it myself, worked the rose in a sling. He said yes. I reminded him that he hadn't called that week, that he hadn't come by even once, that Celine had said he was busy with a launch event. He looked down. I asked if he remembered the following spring. The frost hit early, half the harvest gone, and he told me to consider selling while I still could. He looked away. I asked if he remembered the day he handed me a stack of papers and told me I needed protection. How he said I should let go, that it would be better for everyone. He didn't respond. I said I remembered. Every word, every silence, every time he stood in front of me and spoke like I was already gone. He said nothing for a long while. Then he looked up and asked what happened to us, how we had gotten here. I answered plainly. I said nothing happened to us. Something happened to him. He forgot who he was raised by. He forgot what sacrifice looked like. He forgot that silence is not weakness, that age is not erasure, that land given in honor doesn't belong to those who never bled for it. He blinked, but didn't look away. I told him I didn't hate him, but I couldn't trust him, and trust was the currency we built this vineyard on. Without it, nothing worked. Not the soil, not the hands that tilled it, not the people who showed up every day. He asked if there was anything left to repair. I said no. Because some walls, once broken, don't get patched. They get cleared, and the land is better for it. He sat a little longer, maybe hoping for something more, maybe realizing that nothing more was coming. Then he stood. He thanked me for letting him speak. I didn't reply. He walked back to the car, the same quiet steps he used coming in. The door shut gently. The engine turned over once. He didn't look back. The taillights disappeared down the dirt road. I stayed on the porch until full dark. Then I stood, walked to the gate, and slid the old wooden latch into place. It clicked shut with a weight that felt final. Inside the house, I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table. The documents were still there. The legal records, the trust ledger, Sophie's new payroll list, everything in its place. I placed my palm flat on the surface. Solid, simple, real. There were no trophies to be won here, no revenge to savor, only balance restored, and peace returned. The morning after Malcolm left for the last time, the vineyard was quiet in a different way. It wasn't just the quiet of early light or dew on the grass. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm clears and the sky forgets to be angry. I opened the kitchen window and let the cold air in. The smell of wet earth and morning sun drifted across the room like something clean. I made coffee and stood barefoot in the doorway, watching the rows stretch toward the edge of the hills. Sophie was already out there. I could see her near the western slope, talking to two of the new hires. She wore a flannel shirt tucked into old jeans, a clipboard in one hand, gloves in the other. She looked like she belonged. After breakfast, I walked down to the barn. The floor creaked under my boots, same as always. I pulled down the old chalkboard we used during harvest season and wrote up the week's tasks. Tidy rows, oil the press, check barrels. Sophie came in not long after, her cheeks red from the morning wind. She asked if we were expecting visitors. I said no, not today. She seemed relieved. Then she looked at the board. Read the notes. Looked at me again. I told her to add anything she needed. She hesitated, then stepped forward and wrote something under the list. Update temperature logs, order new filters, repair gate hinge. Her handwriting was cleaner than mine. I looked at her and asked if she wanted to come up to the house after lunch. I had something to show her. She said sure, then turned and walked back toward the vines, her boots leaving prints in the dirt. I waited until the sun was high before I took the envelope out of the drawer. Inside was a letter, a formal amendment to the trust. It named Sophie as co-trustee and eventual successor. It granted her stewardship of the land, the house, and the foundation that managed the non-profit. Not ownership, not in the traditional sense, but care. Full legal control and moral responsibility. It was already notarized, already filed. What she didn't know was that I had written her a letter to go with it. Not a legal letter, just a plain one. By the time she arrived that afternoon, the kitchen was warm with late light, and the kettle on the stove had just begun to hum. I handed her the envelope, told her to sit. She opened it slowly, read the amendment first. Her hands shook a little, but she said nothing. Then she unfolded the letter. She read it all the way through, lips moving just slightly. When she looked up, her eyes were damp. I didn't speak. I let her take whatever time she needed. Finally, she said she didn't know what to say. I told her she didn't have to say anything. She had already said it with the way she showed up every morning, the way she stayed late without asking for more, the way she spoke to the workers like people, not staff, the way she had looked at me after the festival, not with pity, but with a kind of recognition. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. Not because I was tired, not because I had given up, but because I had finally understood what this place was meant to be. It wasn't a reward. It wasn't a retirement gift. It was a living thing, and living things need care. She asked what I would do now. I told her I would stay, just less in charge, more present. I wanted to prune vines without worrying about permits. I wanted to sit by the fence and watch the rows change colour. I wanted to rest without guilt. That evening, we walked the fields together. She asked about my husband. I told her about the first time he saw me in uniform, how he said I looked like I could lead a battalion. I told her how he used to write letters on paper with real stamps, even after we had phones, how he wanted to build a porch swing but never got the chance. She asked what I thought he would say about all of this. I told her he would have liked her. We reached the top of the hill as the sun dropped low. The light turned gold. The vines rustled softly in the wind. Sophie stood quietly for a while. Then she said thank you, not loudly, just enough for the wind to carry. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The land had spoken for both of us. The first time I said the name out loud, I was alone in the barn. Phoenix Vineyard. I wrote it in chalk on the corner of the blackboard, just beneath the harvest notes. The letters looked strange at first, too formal, too bold. But something about them settled right in, like they belonged there all along, waiting to be found. We didn't announce anything right away. Sophie and I kept working like always. The crew kept their routines. But behind the scenes, we began laying the bricks of something new. Eleanor helped us restructure the non-profit to reflect its new mission. What was once just a legal shield now had direction. We filed paperwork to become a foundation focused on agricultural healing and job restoration for widowed veterans and women aging out of the workforce. We called it Stewardship with Dignity. The core idea was simple. Give people land they could work with their hands. Offer them housing, a wage, and a sense of purpose. No speeches, no charity, just soil and sunlight and responsibility. Sophie brought in her cousin Mia, a former army medic who had been discharged 2 years earlier. Mia had been living in her car for 6 months, bouncing between clinics and grocery stores, trying to find something stable. She arrived with 2 duffel bags and a look in her eyes like she didn't expect to stay. We gave her a trailer near the shed, small, but warm. The first morning she offered to help in the fermentation room. By the end of the week, she was running the bottling schedule. Then came Ellen, a retired bus driver whose husband had passed from cancer the year before. She had never worked on a farm, but said she wanted something quiet. We trained her in the cellar. She took to the pace instantly, said she liked the smell of oak barrels better than diesel. By the end of that first month, we had 5 women on the team, each one different, each one carrying something hard, but each one ready to work. Word spread faster than I expected. A journalist from a veterans cooperative came by and spent a day with us. She didn't ask for interviews, she just watched. At the end of the visit, she wrote in her notebook that the vineyard breathed like it had lungs again. Sophie kept everything running: payroll, scheduling, deliveries. I started to step back from decisions and into mornings that were slower, steadier. I still walked the rows, still trimmed branches when the weather allowed, but I no longer carried the weight of ownership. I carried memory. I carried presence. One afternoon, we sat in the tasting room with a small group of local volunteers: teachers, retired nurses, an old mechanic who used to work with my husband. We asked them what they thought the community needed most. The answer came quiet, but clear. Access, not just to jobs, but to belonging. People were tired of being pushed aside, tired of being told their usefulness expired at a certain age. They didn't want speeches or programs. They wanted work that mattered, connection that stayed. That same week, we converted the back half of the barn into a classroom. No whiteboards, just long tables, good coffee, and hands-on learning. Mia taught basic first aid and vineyard safety. Eleanor gave budgeting workshops. I led quiet sessions on seasonal planting, mostly to women who had never touched a grapevine in their life. No one failed. No one was graded. They came. They listened. They asked what time to come back. We painted a wooden sign at the front gate. Phoenix Vineyard. Work. Learn. Belong. It felt right. Fall settled in. The rose turned gold, then copper. The nights got longer, the wind colder. But inside the vineyard, something kept growing. One morning, I watched as Sophie helped Mia fix the front axle of the utility cart. They didn't need my help. I stayed on the porch with a cup of tea and just listened. Later that day, a letter arrived from the county office. The board had recognized the Phoenix model as a formal pilot for community land reinvestment. That meant more visibility, more inquiries, possibly even small grants. I folded the letter carefully and set it in the drawer beside the others. The ones that used to hold court orders and eviction threats, now filled with permits and recognition. The land hadn't changed, but the way we stood on it had. I never told Malcolm about the name, never said a word. I didn't need to. This place was never about revenge. It was about taking something almost broken and making it whole again. And every time someone new arrived with hands worn from work and a heart worn from trying, I saw that the vineyard had already started healing. Not just them, but me. The frost came early that year. It swept in over the hills one night in late November, sharp and silent. The forecast had hinted at a dip, but no one expected a full drop. By the time the sun rose, the vineyard shimmered white, cold like glass. Sophie was the first to notice the damage. She walked the western rows before sunrise and found entire stretches of the young vines singed black at the edges. The irrigation system had held, but the temperature had dropped too fast. We lost nearly a quarter of the new growth. She brought the news up to the house. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tension in her jaw. She already had a plan. Reseed certain rows, cut losses in others, bring in consultants if needed. I nodded and told her to move ahead. It wasn't the first loss we had taken, and it wouldn't be the last. Farming is forgiving only to the patient. But by noon, the calls started. First, it was the produce distributor, then the city council representative, then a regional news outlet. They had all received a copy of a letter, anonymous, full of accusations. It claimed we were mismanaging funds, that the foundation was misreporting labor practices, that the vineyard was using unpaid workers under the guise of community service. It said we had failed a safety audit, exploited vulnerable adults, and were under investigation. None of it was true. But all of it had weight. Thomas called just after lunch. His tone was tight, all business. He had already seen the letter. The phrasing was familiar, too familiar. He believed it had come from Malcolm. Legally, Malcolm had no remaining claim, no standing, no access to records. But a letter didn't need legal weight to cause damage. All it needed was noise. By the end of the day, 2 of our small donors had paused contributions. One volunteer group cancelled a visit. The article was already in draft form. The paper wasn't naming names, but the implication was clear. The vineyard was in trouble. I sat in my room that night with the lights off. The glow from the window cast a soft square on the floor, the kind my husband used to read under when we still had time for quiet. I thought about that first season after I came home from the war, when everything I touched felt unfamiliar, how the only thing that felt steady was soil. And now that steadiness was being chipped away again, not with legal threats, not with contracts, but with doubt. The next morning, I gathered the team. We didn't sit around a table. We stood near the cellar, boots in the dirt, jackets zipped against the wind. I told them what was happening. I told them it wasn't the first time people questioned us, and it wouldn't be the last. But I also told them we wouldn't defend ourselves with silence. We would respond with truth, with records, with results. Sophie and Eleanor pulled together every document we had: training logs, safety records, tax filings. We made them public. Not because we had to, but because transparency was the only thing that grows stronger under scrutiny. Mia reached out to the veteran networks and asked them to come see the vineyard for themselves, not with cameras, not with agendas, just with eyes open. Within a week, we had visitors. A former Navy corpsman walked the fields with Ellen. A retired Coast Guard officer helped clear frost damage with Mia. They asked questions, took notes, left with something in their eyes I hadn't seen in a while. Respect, born from effort. The article came out 5 days later. It was neutral but balanced. It mentioned the letter, but it also mentioned our open records. It included quotes from volunteers. One line stood out. "This place runs on sweat, not secrecy." Still, the damage lingered. Some donors didn't return. Some whispers stayed. Some invitations stopped coming. But the core held. The crew showed up each morning. The soil stayed beneath our feet. Sophie didn't flinch, neither did I. A month later, a local radio producer asked to do a segment. She wanted to focus on resilience. She had read the article, seen the follow-ups. She called the vineyard an ecosystem of second chances. I said yes. She came with one microphone and a notepad. She asked about the early years, the war, the land, the sun. I didn't give her everything, but I gave her enough. The episode aired that Sunday. It was short, just 10 minutes. But the calls that followed weren't from donors or reporters. They were from women, widows, veterans, teachers, grandmothers, tired people, hopeful people. They wanted to help. They wanted to learn. They wanted to start again. That was the moment I knew. The vineyard wasn't fragile. It had been burned and buried and cut back. And still it stood. Still it gave. And as long as it did, I would too. The envelope sat on my desk for 3 days. It was thick, cream-coloured, with the vineyard's embossed seal at the top. My name, Dorothy Ainsley, printed in serif font at the centre. Below that, a line I hadn't written before. Founder and Chair Emerita, Ainsley Veteran Foundation. The title meant nothing to me. Not really. But it meant something to the rest of them. To Malcolm, especially. The board had already approved the restructure. The legal team had filed the transition paperwork quietly, from a family-run LLC to a community non-profit under state protection. I didn't need my son's approval, and I certainly wasn't asking for it. But still, I wrote the letter. Not for reconciliation, not for revenge, just for truth. Inside the envelope was a single sheet. Heavy stock. My handwriting, small and even. No flourishes, no pleasantries. It started like this. You said I would lose everything if I chose strangers over blood. You said I'd regret turning my back on family. But what you never understood was that family is not defined by who shares your name. It's who shows up, who stays when things crack, who helps put things back without demanding a share. I didn't mention the lawsuit, didn't detail the frozen accounts or the discovery files, or the fact that his attorney had quietly withdrawn 2 weeks ago. I didn't list what the new board had done in the past 6 months. The grant awards, the land preservation deal, the women's veteran housing initiative we were about to launch. I didn't need to. Malcolm would hear about it all eventually, but the part I needed to say, I said plainly, "You did not fail because you were cut out. You were cut out because you chose yourself, over and over, until there was nothing left of the people around you." And at the bottom, I signed it. Dorothy Ainsley Mother, veteran, owner. But I never mailed it. Instead, I tucked it into the back of a wooden box in my study, next to an old army pin and a photograph of my husband in front of the original foundation marker. Then I called Sophie. We met at the North Field just after sunset. The air was cool but not biting. The vines had already been pruned for winter. The soil smelled like rain and cut stems. She walked with purpose, no hesitation. She had grown into this role in a way I couldn't have predicted. Maybe because she had nothing to prove, just something to protect. I handed her the legal transfer documents. Her hands didn't shake. The foundation was hers now, not in title only, but in structure. The bylaws had been rewritten, the protections in place. Any attempt to revert it back to private ownership would trigger an automatic review by the state. And even if someone tried, there was nothing left to take. I had already rerouted the trust into 3 parts. One for housing women veterans over the age of 50, another for agricultural education for widows of war, and the third for rehabilitation programs for wounded caretakers like myself. Not 1 cent would go to any blood relative. The vineyard no longer belonged to me. It belonged to those who needed it. I thought I would feel a wave of grief in that moment, or something close to the loss I felt the day my husband didn't come home. But I didn't. I felt clean. Sophie stayed silent for a long moment. Then she did something simple. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small pin. It was shaped like a vine curled around a single grape. She had it made by one of the young artisans from the outreach program. She pinned it to the lapel of my jacket. She didn't say thank you. And I didn't need her to, because what she did next said more than any speech. She walked ahead of me into the dark rows, toward the house, not to be polite, but to lead. And I let her. Later that night, I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of black tea and no phone. The sky was sharp with stars. Coyotes howled somewhere deep past the tree line, the kind of night that used to make me ache with memory. Now it felt like memory had loosened its grip. The vineyard would go on, without me, because of me. And that was enough. The news didn't reach Malcolm through a call or even a formal letter. It reached him through an alert. A cold ping on his phone while he was sitting in a leased conference room in Palo Alto, trying to convince 2 investors that his tech biodynamic farming startup deserved their backing. He opened the notification with a casual flick, expecting another automated vineyard update. Instead, he froze. Transfer of entity ownership confirmed. Ainsley Estate now listed under Ainsley Veteran Foundation, non-profit division. He blinked, then blinked again. The meeting went quiet. Across from him, the younger investor, mid-30s in a clean navy suit, leaned forward and asked if everything was all right. Malcolm didn't answer. His hand went to his throat. His collar suddenly felt tight. Outside the glass, the city buzzed. Inside, something cracked. He excused himself, stepped out into the hallway, and made 5 calls in a row. No one answered. The vineyard's general manager, the accountant, even Jenna. By the time he called his lawyer, the man already knew. "You didn't tell me the ownership was at risk," the lawyer said. His voice wasn't angry, just distant. "I can't represent you if you weren't transparent with me or the firm. Consider this our last correspondence." Malcolm stood alone in a hallway, lined with awards he didn't earn, surrounded by men pitching green dreams with someone else's land. And his grip on everything he thought was his began to loosen. It got worse quickly. The next morning, the news was public. The local paper ran a full profile on the Ainsley Veteran Foundation's restructure. Dorothy's face in black and white, stoic but proud. Headlines spoke of legacy, vision, and generational restoration. Buried in the article, almost as an afterthought, was a one-line quote. "The land should serve those who served, not the ones who only inherited its shade." No name mentioned, but everyone knew who it was for. A donor conference he had scheduled that week dropped him from the lineup. 3 board members from a venture group he sat on quietly withdrew their support. And the startup's primary investor, a veteran himself, pulled funding by Friday afternoon. Malcolm drove up to the vineyard 3 days later, not to speak, just to see. He parked outside the gates and stared through the fencing, expecting to feel some rush of anger or urgency, but what met him was a quiet he couldn't interpret. The new sign was already up. Ainsley Veteran Foundation, Northfield Housing Project, opening fall. A young woman in a grey work vest walked across the gravel toward him. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just pointed to the sign behind her and said, "We don't allow unregistered vehicles beyond the gate. Security's been tightened." He gave her his name. She blinked once. That doesn't change the rule. He left. Back in the city, he tried to stabilize his footing. He called old colleagues, tried to rebrand, shifted focus, even floated the idea of a memoir, a comeback story. But Dorothy had been methodical. Every asset once tied to his name was now reallocated. The bank account they had once shared for vineyard operations had been frozen months earlier. Dorothy had rerouted all the funds through the non-profit's financial protection channels. Anything Malcolm tried to access triggered an automatic audit. The house he thought he'd inherit after Dorothy passed had been quietly rezoned and transferred under the foundation's trust. Even the car he had been leasing through vineyard funds was now in default. A quiet but precise humiliation. Then came the final blow. An article on the homepage of a major agriculture investment blog. It wasn't about him, but it was. It was about failed legacy ventures. How generational wealth, when built on selfishness and assumption, collapses faster than sandcastles at high tide. The article referenced several examples. His name wasn't mentioned, but there were just enough details to make it unmistakable. A friend forwarded it with a half-hearted emoji. That night, Malcolm sat alone in a condo he didn't own, with a drink he didn't enjoy, and stared at a wall he never decorated. His wife had left the month before, said he was angry all the time, said he'd changed. He hadn't changed. He had just been revealed. And there was no vineyard to run to anymore. I heard Malcolm had returned to town 2 days before I saw him. Ava was the first to mention it, briefly, as we sat at the back end of the community garden that used to be the old bottling shed. She didn't say much, just a soft, cautious, "He's back." I had expected it. What else was he going to do, now that the show had folded? Still, my body tensed as if someone had tapped on a bruise that had almost healed. When I walked into the main office of the foundation that morning, he was already there, sitting in the lobby, legs crossed awkwardly, head bowed like a child waiting outside the principal's office. He stood when he saw me, but not fully. His back curved forward, as if he had aged decades in a matter of weeks. I didn't offer a smile. I simply nodded at the assistant and said, "Let's use the East Conference Room." We walked in silence down the hallway. The lights were bright. The air was cool. Outside the windows, I could see the early volunteers setting up the spring planting beds. The room was quiet when we entered. I closed the door behind us and stood at the far end of the long table. Malcolm hesitated, then slowly sat at the closest chair. He looked down at his hands, then up at me. I remained standing. He began softly. I could barely hear him. I didn't come here to fight. I stayed silent. He continued. I didn't know what I was doing. I was angry. I thought, you thought it would always be yours, I said. Not loud, just even, steady. He swallowed hard. His hands folded and unfolded on the table. I made a mess of everything. Yes, you did. There was no dramatics, no yelling, the way people expect when families fall apart. There was just the weight of air between two people who once belonged to the same home and now sat across the ruins of it. He said, you could have warned me, given me a chance to fix it before going nuclear. I stepped closer but still didn't sit. You had years of chances. What you wanted was forgiveness without accountability. That's not a transaction I make anymore. His jaw clenched. His eyes, for a moment, flickered with the old defiance. But it didn't last. That part of him was tired now. You gave everything away, he said, more to himself than me. The land, the money, the name. I gave it to something bigger than us, bigger than your pride, bigger than my pain. I gave it to people who understand what it costs to serve without expecting worship, the way your father lived. That struck. His eyes dropped again. I finally sat, not beside him, across. You were given so much, not just the land. You were given legacy, story, blood, and you spat on it the moment it didn't serve your ambition. He didn't speak. I kept going. You weren't punished, Malcolm. You were simply removed from what you tried to poison. That isn't revenge. That's pruning. For a moment, I thought he might cry, but he didn't. He just nodded. Not in agreement, just recognition. What now? He asked, his voice barely holding. You do what I did after the war, after your father died. You build something of your own, not off my back, not off someone else's shoulders. If you can do that, maybe one day you'll understand what it means to hold something without crushing it. He nodded again, then stood. As he walked to the door, he paused. I hope one day I can show you I'm better than the man I've been. I didn't respond. He opened the door and left. I sat there for a while, not thinking, just breathing, letting the silence settle around me like a long coat finally taken off after a storm. This wasn't victory. It wasn't closure in the dramatic sense. But it was peace. Not because he asked for it, because I no longer needed anything from him. It rained the morning we dedicated the new wellness wing, not heavy, but steady, like the earth was finally exhaling. The ribbon across the gate was a soft blue, the same shade as the hydrangeas that once grew wild at the edge of my garden. I stood beside Ava, who wore her grandmother's brooch and carried a clipboard like it was an extension of her will. She whispered the schedule softly, but I wasn't listening. Not really. I was watching the sky, letting the drops fall gently on my hands. Behind us stood the women, the ones I'd taught, the ones who had lived through storms even darker than mine. Former medics, displaced mothers, one woman who survived a fire with only the skin on her face spared. They wore blue scarves and carried little cards with their names embroidered. They didn't look like survivors. They looked like a future. The plaque read, the Dorothy Ellsworth Center for Restoration. For those who were told they were too much or too little, come, be whole. When they called my name, I didn't prepare a speech. I just stepped forward, let the mic rest in my palm, and said what I had carried for so long. I wasn't always kind to myself. I mistook silence for grace. I let others carve names into my back and called it loyalty. But what you see here today isn't revenge, it's reclamation. I stepped back. That was all. And they clapped, not wildly, but warm and full. Later that evening, long after the last folding chair had been packed and the lawn cleared, I walked back to the lake house alone. The porch light glowed faint yellow. The chairs were dry now, and the breeze smelled like cedar and fresh soil. I sat slowly, my left arm, still tender after all these years, resting in my lap like it always had. I thought of Franklin. He would have laughed at the ceremony. He never liked big gestures. But I think he would have liked the purpose, the groundedness of it all. Not a monument, but a place that breathes. The wind shifted. I could hear owls farther out in the trees. In my pocket was a letter, one I had written weeks ago, not to Malcolm, not to the community, to myself. I unfolded it now and read it silently. You have survived more than they will ever understand. You did not break when it would have been easier. You did not scream when silence made you stronger. You did not disappear. You became, not out of spite, but out of choice. You walked out of fire and built a home from ash. Let this be enough. I tucked the letter under the cushion. The next morning, I would teach a class on strength training for women over 60. Ava had made me promise. We would laugh, maybe cry. But no one there would call me a burden again. Malcolm had not returned since our talk. He might come back one day, or not. Either way, I had no room left in me for unfinished stories. I had this porch, this view, these roots. The lake did not shimmer tonight. It was still, wide, steady, like me. If you've made it this far, maybe you've carried something too. Pain that went unspoken, respect that was never returned, or silence mistaken for weakness. I hope Dorothy's story reminded you that it's never too late to reclaim your worth. Not with noise, but with clarity, with calm. If you've ever had to walk away from those who said you owed them everything just to protect what's left of yourself, you're not alone. Leave a light on for yourself. You deserve to come home.